The morning of the 30th of June, 1908, begins in silence over the Siberian taiga. In Yeniseisk Governorate, above the watershed of the Podkamenaya, the stony Tunguska River, something is about to arrive. At the Vanavara trading post, a modest outpost roughly 65 kilometers to the south, a peasant farmer named S.B. Semenov has settled onto his porch in the cool morning air. It is 7:17. Without any warning, the northern horizon tears open. Semenov would later describe it as the sky splitting in two. A vast rift filled instantly with roaring fire. The light was unlike anything born of this earth. It blazed outward in a great arc, overwhelming the pale morning and turning the dark tree line of the taiga into a stark, trembling silhouette against an impossible brightness. Hard on the heels of that brilliance came heat. An instantaneous thermal pulse, so fierce that Semenov believed his shirt had caught fire. He pressed his hands to the fabric instinctively, expecting flame. The sensation lasted only a moment before the shockwave arrived. A concussive front of compressed air that struck the trading post and hurled him approximately 2 meters from his porch, leaving him sprawled hard on the ground. The entire sequence, the blinding light, the scorching heat, the concussive blast, had elapsed in only moments. Thermal and pressure energy had arrived nearly simultaneously at his distance, the signature of a single catastrophic airburst above the forest canopy. Semenov's account would not be formally recorded for 2 more decades, gathered at last by Leonid Kulik, who arrived at Vanavara with a Soviet expedition in 1930. The region that received this catastrophe was, by any measure, among the most isolated territories on Earth. Stretching across what is now Krasnoyarsk Krai, the Evenkiski district was home chiefly to the Evenki, an indigenous people who had lived in this boreal wilderness for centuries. Semi-nomadic reindeer herders by tradition, they followed their animals across millions of hectares of taiga, moving through a landscape that had never known a fixed road. The nearest trading post of any description was Vanavara, a modest outpost sitting roughly 65 to 70 kilometers south of what would become the epicentre. Even that distance, across unbridged rivers and dense roadless forest, represented a journey measured in days. No telegraph line connected this part of Siberia to the outside world. Permanent Russian settlements of any significance lay hundreds of kilometers further south and west. The Russian Empire in 1908 had no mechanism capable of detecting an approaching object, or of rapidly cataloguing what had happened after the fact. The seismological network was thin, its listening posts clustered in the empire's western cities. Weather stations of any kind were a rarity east of the Urals. Astronomy of the period was concerned with fixed observations of the night sky, not the surveillance of incoming debris. St. Petersburg was, functionally, another world. Among the Evenki clans, news would travel only as far and as fast as a person on foot could carry it, across terrain measured in days rather than hours. Their family groups were scattered across millions of hectares, far beyond any reach of the imperial telegraph. And yet it was this very emptiness that kept the death toll so low. Explosion had found one of the few places on Earth where almost nobody lived. The object responsible was no visitor from the edge of the solar system. Scientists working from energy estimates and orbital modeling have concluded it was a stony asteroid, composed of silicate rock roughly 50 to 60 meters across. That is approximately the height of a 25-story building, dense enough to carry catastrophic energy, yet fragile enough, as it would prove, to be undone by the atmosphere itself. It arrived from the east-southeast, entering the atmosphere at an angle of roughly 30 degrees to the horizon, a shallow inclination that would dictate everything that followed. Its velocity was approximately 27 kilometers per second, close to 80 times the speed of sound. At that speed, the journey from the outer atmosphere to the explosion point took mere seconds, an interval too brief for any warning. As the rock plunged through thickening air, the pressure ahead of it climbed beyond anything the surrounding atmosphere could absorb smoothly. The leading face began to superheat, shedding fragments in a torrent of superheated plasma, a streak of brilliant bluish-white light cutting across the Siberian morning. In Kirinsk, more than 400 kilometers distant, witnesses later described a bright column of bluish light moving steadily across the sky, trailing a luminous cloud behind it. The rock's fate was sealed by a phenomenon called ram pressure. Between 5 and 10 kilometers above the taiga, the compressed air bearing down on the object's face exceeded the tensile strength of the silicate rock, and the body shattered explosively. The energy, rather than driving a column of rock and soil into a crater, radiated outward through the atmosphere in every direction. Scientists call this an airburst. No impact pit formed. At an altitude somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers, the object tore itself apart in a fraction of a second. Energy released, later calculated at 10 to 15 megatons of TNT equivalent, detonated in a single catastrophic pulse, and revised modeling published in 2019 would raise the upper estimate to between 20 and 30 megatons. At minimum, the explosion outstripped the Hiroshima bomb by roughly 1,000 times. The thermal pulse and blast wave struck the taiga almost simultaneously. Before the sound had carried to the horizon, approximately 80 million trees lay flat across 2,150 square kilometers, a tract of Siberian wilderness larger than Luxembourg. Photographs from the Kulik expedition, taken nearly 2 decades later, show a broken landscape of upended root systems and horizontal trunks vanishing into every distance. The destruction zone was not a simple circle. Because the object had entered the atmosphere at a shallow angle, the fallen trees fanned out in 2 lobes, tracing the outline of a vast butterfly pinned against the taiga, its wingspan roughly 70 kilometers, and its body some 55 kilometers long. Each felled tree lay with its roots pointing back toward the detonation point, enabling later investigators to triangulate the blast origin with considerable precision. At the epicenter, directly beneath the detonation, something unexpected waited. A zone roughly 8 kilometers across held trees that had not fallen. They remained standing, stripped entirely of bark and branches, their surfaces seared smooth by the thermal pulse. Scientists who later reached this place compared the site to a forest of telegraph poles. The object that had done all of this left nothing of itself behind, vaporized entirely in its own explosion. Scholarly analysis compiled across decades eventually identified approximately 700 eyewitness accounts, mentioning nearly 2,000 individuals from 386 separate locations. The human death toll remains disputed. Modern assessments conclude that no more than 3 people perished, a figure startlingly low for an event of such force, yet entirely explained by one fact. The taiga was, by any measure, almost entirely empty of human settlement. Among those whose accounts were later recorded, an Evenki woman named Akulina offered testimony of striking physical immediacy. Camped near the Shame River when the blast struck, she was thrown from her tent by repeated shaking. A blinding flash followed, then a wave of intense heat that swept through the forest. She would describe these sensations to researchers who came asking years, and then decades later. The economic losses extended far beyond human injury. Luchetkan, an Evenki herder, told Kulik that a relative had been pasturing more than 1,500 reindeer inside the blast zone when the event struck. He later found only charred and scattered carcasses. Across the wider area, total losses ran to the hundreds, possibly approaching 1,000 animals. Tents, provisions, and stored tools of the Evenki clans, whose territory it had leveled, were gone entirely. The Evenki named what had happened. The destructive force was Ogdi, also rendered as Ogdi, the god of thunder and fire. Its visitation upon their territory was understood as divine wrath, and Evenki guides hired by later expeditions refused to approach the blast site, saying the land remained cursed. Their oral tradition was captured nearly 2 decades on by ethnographer Inokenti Suslov, who began collecting accounts in 1920. Suslov, who began collecting accounts in 1930s. The explosion's power registered far beyond the taiga. Seismographic stations across Eurasia detected ground waves from the detonation within hours, the tremors equivalent to an earthquake of approximately magnitude 5. Readings came in from Irkutsk and Tashkent, and from instruments as distant as Germany and the United Kingdom, each set of numbers pointing toward a catastrophic event in a part of the world that most observers had never heard of. More distinctive still were the records drawn by the microbarograph, an instrument sensitive to minute changes in atmospheric pressure. Stations in Germany, Denmark, Croatia, the United Kingdom, Batavia, in what is now Indonesia, and Washington, D.C., all captured the same sharp signature. That pressure wave was powerful enough to complete 2 full circuits of the Earth before finally dissipating, a feat without precedent in the instrumental record of the time. Then came the nights. In the days following the 30th of June, skies over much of Europe and Asia filled with a strange, persisting luminescence. In London and Stockholm, people stepping outside after midnight discovered they could read a newspaper by that pale glow alone. Photographers in Sweden and Scotland worked long exposure plates at the midnight hour and returned with images showing a sky as bright as deep twilight. The explanation lay high above the clouds. The detonation had driven microscopic particles of ice and dust into the mesosphere, where they caught and scattered sunlight long after the sun had fallen below the horizon. Across northern Europe, noctilucent cloud sightings spiked sharply that July. And yet, no coordinated scientific inquiry followed. The region was too remote, communications too slow, and the Russian scientific establishment too consumed with other concerns to dispatch anyone to look. Russia between 1908 and 1921 was a nation consumed by successive catastrophe. The First World War bled its armies white across the Eastern Front. The Revolution of 1917 overthrew a dynasty, then fractured into a civil war that did not end until 1922. Scientific institutions were dissolved, rebuilt, and renamed. No government possessed the resources, the stability, or the inclination to mount an expedition into the remote Siberian taiga. The man who finally changed this was Leonid Alexeyevich Kulik, born in 1883 in Dorpat, present-day Tartu, Estonia. A mineralogist at Petrograd's Mineralogical Museum, he had spent years cataloguing meteorites and grown convinced Tunguska was the largest meteorite fall in recorded history. In 1921, he reached the outlying villages, gathered compelling eyewitness testimony, and returned without ever reaching the blast site, but with evidence enough to secure full academy funding. In February 1927, Kulik set out with a small team, including a topographer and a photographer. Getting to the site required weeks, first by rail, then riverboat through the thawing waterways, then horse sledge, and at the last stretch, on foot through spring mud. Their Evenki guides, when they reached the edge of the blast zone, refused to go further. The interior was cursed ground, they said. Kulik reached the epicentre in the spring of 1927, nearly 19 years after the blast. He had expected a crater, a deep scar in the earth with meteoritic iron buried beneath it. What he found instead silenced him. Charred and downed timber stretched to every horizon, and at the precise center of the devastation stood a grove of dead trees still rooted upright, their trunks stripped entirely bare of branches. The fallen trunks radiated away from that central stand in every direction, their exposed root systems turned uniformly back toward the blast point, a compass in wood that allowed the detonation site to be mapped. Kulik returned in 1928, again across 1929 and 30, and for a final time in 1938 and 39, drilling test holes throughout in search of meteorite fragments. He found none. The absence of crater and meteoritic material would perplex researchers for decades. The question Kulik could never fully answer outlasted him by decades. Scientists divided sharply over what had detonated above the taiga. A comet offered an appealing solution. Its icy nucleus would have vaporized completely on entry, leaving no recoverable fragments to find. The bright, anomalous nights reported across Europe in the days following the event seemed to support this, suggesting that water ice had been lofted high into the event, the upper atmosphere. Real resolution came through computation. A 2001 study used orbital mechanics modeling to reconstruct the trajectory and physical properties of the Tunguska object, arriving at an 83% probability that it had been an asteroid. Researchers subsequently bolstered that conclusion through laboratory work. Microscopic silicate spherules, recovered from peat bogs near the blast site, bore the chemical signature of rocky material rather than the icy constitution of a comet. One further hypothesis demanded attention before the science could close. Researchers working ahead of Tunguska's centenary proposed that Lake Checo, a circular lake 8 kilometres from the epicenter, was an impact crater formed by a surviving fragment. The idea attracted serious interest. Sediment cores drilled in 2017 proved otherwise. The lake's layered bed showed it had existed for at least 280 years before 1908. With Lake Checo eliminated, scientific consensus crystallized around a single account. Tunguska was an airburst caused by a stony asteroid approximately 50 to 60 meters wide that fragmented and detonated at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers without depositing any significant material on the ground. The explosion was enormous and thoroughly explained. The man who had devoted the better part of his career to establishing that would never know it. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Leonid Kulik volunteered for the People's Militia. He was 57 years old. Captured by German forces, he was held at a prisoner of war camp in Spars-Demensk, where he died of typhus on the 24th of April 1942, aged 58. In 1958, the Soviet Union issued a stamp for the 50th anniversary of the event, bearing Kulik's portrait. Anniversary of the event, bearing Kulik's portrait. The object that detonated above the Podkamennaya Tunguska in 1908 released energy estimated at 10 to 15 megatons over a landscape where almost no one lived. That remoteness was a matter of pure chance. The same trajectory, extended by mere minutes, would have carried that detonation over St. Petersburg, or Berlin, or Warsaw. The difference between a footnote in science and a catastrophe reshaping modern history was measured in seconds of orbital geometry. The physics repeated themselves, at smaller scale, on the morning of February 15, 2013. An 18-meter asteroid entered the atmosphere above Chelyabinsk, Russia, releasing approximately 440 kilotons of energy, around 30 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb. The shockwave shattered windows across the region, and more than 1,500 people were injured by the flying glass. Not one observatory on Earth had detected the rock in advance. The Chelyabinsk event accelerated institutional responses that had been building for years. In December 2016, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution ARE 7190, formally designating June 30th as International Asteroid Day, tying the calendar to Tunguska's date. That same year, NASA established its Planetary Defense Coordination Office. 6 years on, the DART spacecraft deliberately struck the small asteroid, Dimorphos, and measurably altered its orbit, the first time humanity had moved a space rock on purpose. In the Evenkiysky taiga, the forest Kulik catalogued has largely reclaimed itself. The scorched trunks he photographed have rotted away, and the trees that replaced them show almost nothing of what happened on that June morning. Tunguska was not a warning when it struck, because no one watching the sky in 1908 was positioned to act on what they saw. The century of science that followed converted it into one. That was the story, here on Errata. If you enjoy forgotten history, told accuracy first, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, and we will keep bringing the past back to light.